What's up guys, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through the Killer Chaos OS build loop, and this is what I'm actively implementing from the lessons that I've learned and what I'm using to build into the future. And the reason why I'm using this or showing you this is because the mission for me is to build raw and real, to basically show you the mental models and frameworks that we're actively using, and also to build a bit better picture into the future of what it is that we're going to be building into the future as well, and to solve real big problems within organizations in terms of systems, software, and backend systems. And basically to also call in visionaries, people that get the mission that we're ultimately building and why we are doing the things that we are doing, and ultimately just to build a cool network of people that we can network with and also build and get feedback from. And this is why we're actively doing this and showing you what it is that we're building. And I like to break it down into 7 simple steps, of which the first one is the build loop is mapping out the chaos. And why this is key is because a system is only as good as its blueprint. Get this wrong and it's chaos squared. The number one thing that I see or that I've actively implemented and learned from is by having too many problems that you're solving for initially, you ultimately lose track of the vision and the goal of the root cause that you are solving. And you simply fix this by starting with the mess and asking simple questions such as what's breaking your events, and then you simply just jot it down in Bear Notes or just in the Notes app, and then you sketch the fix. For example, we basically use Figma mockups for vendor tracking and then Make.com for budget alerts, but it ultimately just comes down to what is the one problem or one core issue that we're solving, and how can we build the 2-3 other things around that. And the lesson that I've learned from this is ultimately to say, hey, nail one point, vendor delays for example, before going wide into solving 2-3 more other problems that the business may be having. Because if you start off with 7 and you try to narrow that down, ultimately when you're in the final stages of development and feedback, you're going to realize that there were certain core features that you didn't build simply because you didn't solve the core issues that ultimately led to the foundation of the other ones. And the grounding question that I like to ask for this is, what's the one chaos point I solve first for my clients, which ultimately leads us to then building 2-3 more other solutions for our clients in terms of a new level of understanding as well. And why this is important, because it ultimately leads us to the second point, which is building it rough and then building it fast as well. And one of the things that I've ultimately realized is speed beats polish. Planners need relief now and not later. And the reason for this is ultimately speed is so important in this sense of solving chaos, because your chaos is not waiting for you. It's ultimately leading you to losing revenue, which you need solved now and not later. And how I actively do this is sprint. 2 weeks Airtable prototypes for vendor sync, Make.com for automations. So this is basically just building out a fast solution or an MVP, and then we say, hey, this is what we're testing out and this is how it's going to look into the future. And then we focus on tools over code. So we say Figma UI, Zap triggers shippable in days, which ultimately allows us to build out a makeshift model or prototype, which ultimately says, hey, if this prototype works, we can then scale it up into the full custom solution that we have. And the lesson that I've learned from this is done is better than perfect. Rough systems still save time. Ultimately, what we're doing and what we are solving is the outcome, not necessarily the tools. So it's saying, hey, if we can solve the solution or if we can provide the outcome, the solution doesn't have to be perfect, we can perfect it later. And this ultimately leads us to moving fast and also being tactical in the decisions that we do make, which ultimately allows us to push out better products much quicker. And the grounding question that I like to ask myself and the team is, where am I stalling for perfection when good is enough? Because most of the time I found myself saying, hey, we need to perfect this, but the ultimate thing that we need to focus on is not actually perfecting it, but getting it down, which ultimately leads us to slowing down. And the number one thing in business that I've personally learned is that speed always wins. most of the time what fixes the solutions or the problems that you're having is ultimately speed, and you need to just move more agile and tactically if you want to just improve your product. Because if you take 10 years to fix one product, how are you going to build 10, 20 others if you're not moving with speed and iterating and learning from that, and also gathering feedback? So this is why this is important for me, and this is what I've also just discovered and I'm actively implementing moving on into the future. And the third one then becomes smashing it before it ships. And why this is key is ultimately untested systems crash under pressure. Test hard, win big. And the number one thing that you don't want to do is to ship a final product and you haven't tested it. You need to go through rigorous tests to ultimately break the system and see, hey, this is its breaking point. If we add 10, 20, 1,000 people onto it, how is it going to work under load? And how can we actively use that to then better scale and understand our mental models, so that when we do scale, we ultimately know all the points of which ultimately can break, and then we build around that. And then we can do it by ultimately saying, hey, let's create 20 vendors that are fake. Let's trigger delays. Let's watch it break and see how the system reacts. And just ultimately just leading that to say, hey, these are the points where it's breaking. And then we ultimately tailor the solution for that. And then we drop a beta, of which this planners test early to say, hey, this is what works. And feedback is the number one thing. If you heard me before, I like to say feedback is key, and this is important because simply the solution that you're building out, it requires a lot of feedback, and you need to be open-minded in the sense that, hey, you're not going to get it first time, and that's okay. Now how can you build better and move more tactically and agile into the future to build better solutions? And this is why feedback is also super important, and this is why we also implemented the chaos feedback cycle, where we actively implement and test to say, hey, this is where feedback is leading us. Let's actively develop in that sense. And the lesson that I've actively learned from this is every flaw found is a disaster dodged. Embrace the breaks, because that is where victory is found. And the grounding question that I like to ask myself over here is, what's the one spot I'm scared to test but need to? Because I've oftentimes found myself actively building and then saying, hey, if this breaks, everything breaks. But that's the point of doing this tests, is to ultimately stress test your system and stress test the solution to say, hey, these are the breaking points. Now, how do we actively solve that? And just being a learning sponge and just soaking up the knowledge and data from that ultimately leads you to a new level of understanding, which ultimately leads to how you keep the team tight, which is point number 4 of saying, hey, solo is slow, teamwork turns chaos into systems. And how we actively do this is we do quick syncs, say 5 minutes with the marketing team, say, hey, what's done, what's next, what do we actively need to solve for, and then clear roles. So say, hey, the design team is sorting this out, the SDR team is sorting this, and devs are actively building out the system. And then we overlap, because overlap kills speed, and this is the number one thing that you don't want to do within how you build your solutions. Because if you're actively building and everyone's doing the same thing, then you're just gonna have this situation where everyone's working on the same thing and they're not gonna know what it is that they need to be focusing on, which ultimately results you leading to a slower build time. And this is what's gonna kill the overall build and speed and precision of the solution that you're building. And this is a very big lesson that I've had to personally take, that, hey, we need to not overlap what we build. Just make sure that the team understands and everyone is segmented and doing different roles. And this lesson that I've learned from this is, hey, small wins. Hey, the SDR team nails this, and that ultimately builds momentum, because the number one thing is people need to feel like they're doing something. And once momentum slows down, that's where people feel unproductive, and that is the worst thing that you could ultimately have within a team. And this understanding is something that I've actively had to implement and learn as well, and I'm still actively implementing. And the grounding question that comes from this is, how can I make my team's next win stupidly simple? Stupidly simple. that is the question that I ask myself. How can I make my team's next win stupidly simple? Simply by just asking that question, it ultimately leads us to a new level of understanding that ultimately leads to the team understanding their specific roles and what to do next. And that ultimately leads into number 5, of which is calling the shots that stick. And why this is key is because bad calls tank builds, frameworks keep me sharp. With me, I like to build frameworks because they're mental models and representations of how to think things through from first principles to say, hey, we need to ask questions that are relevant to us, leading to a new level of understanding so that we can build better systems and processes within the team. Because if someone doesn't understand something within 60 seconds, then we need to look at, hey, is what we're explaining clearly definable and explainable in 60 seconds or less, or is it just too complex? And how do we break that down? Because asking the right questions ultimately leads to you finding an easier answer, or just having that understanding that ultimately allows the team to have that new level of understanding. And how I do this is focusing on impact over versus effort, of which high impact activities or features, vendor syncs, low frequency, fancy UIs, and having all these things, because ultimately impact is more important. The business does not care saying, hey, we have the best UI, but the back end is the worst. That does not make sense. You need to focus on impact, and this is what I'm actively implementing in terms of how we're building, and frameworks lead to that new level of understanding and higher impact. And gut versus data, so saying, hey, client says urgent, usage shows ignored, and then being able to balance both, because if you're not able to balance both, that's when you have a problem in terms of how you're using your gut over data. And data always trumps gut most of the time, but there's certain situations where your gut is right, but most of the time businesses just focus solely on data. And the lesson that I've learned from this is overthinking delays, decide fast and fix later. Say, hey, we need to stop overthinking, or asking ourselves, hey, are we overthinking or overcomplicating this process a bit too much? And how can we reduce that into simple steps that ultimately allow us to then decide now and then fix it later as we go, but not rebuilding the entire system from scratch? And the grounding question I like to ask from here is, what decision am I dodging that's holding up the build? Most of the time, I've just found that the decision is, hey, we need a new hire, or hey, I can't do this myself, let me get someone else to do it. Sure, this has sped up processes a lot further by just saying, hey, let me not dodge this decision and let me just make it now, and just build frameworks that ultimately lead to me also saying, hey, I need to be able to explain this, and the person needs to see, or the team member needs to see the vision that I have for this build, and they need to be able to implement it without me actively being there. And then this ultimately leads to number 6, which I value a lot, and I also trying to instill this into the team as well, of locking in stakeholders. So this is basically everyone involved in the project needs to be happy and also trust what it is that we're building, because without trust there's no buy-in, and planners and teams need to believe in what we're building. Ultimately there's no point. I've realized that the number one thing is trust. If you don't trust the project, or you don't trust what it is that we're building or that you're building actively, this ultimately leads to you asking the questions of, hey, I don't trust this, so what is the point? What is the point of building this? Then you have doubt and you say, hey, is this really valuable? And that is the worst thing that you would need. And just building that trust and ultimately having that buy-in as well from all the stakeholders is super important, from the team and the clients and everyone else involved in the project. Even if it's just a minor role, feedback also is super important, and trust and buyback is super important in that regard. And how I do this is show the mess, saying, hey, here's where we're at, and here's the fix, and how can we fix it? How can we actively refine the machine? And what is your input? No matter how small it is, it can make a big difference, because it brings a new level of clarity that we may have not considered in the beginning, but now see as the way forward. And we deliver early. So saying, hey, quick wins, dashboard mockup in Figma proves that it works. Hey, or just having the dashboard mockup and saying, hey, this is how it looks. Now let's figure out how to make it work. And the lesson that I've learned here is transparency beats promises. Show them, don't tell them. So this is the number one thing of saying, hey, even if you're behind in terms of your development schedule, just by being open and saying, hey, we've had a delay, this is what's going on, informing them of all the critical information that they need so that they're able to move tactically within their business and plan for that, is ultimately just going to build that level of trust. You don't want to be that person, and I found that I don't want to be that person that keeps quiet and says, hey, our deadline is on the 15th, but then on the 17th would now like, hey, we're going to need an extra day. I would much rather take the road of saying, hey, we have a delay, because that ultimately leads to you building trust with all the stakeholders, and also just being accountable for your actions, and also just being accountable as a leader as well. And the grounding question I like to ask here is, where am I hiding progress that could build trust? This can be simple, like saying, hey, this is the reason why we're slow. Hey, it's all on me. But that ultimately leads to trust being built between you and the stakeholders, even though it may sound like it sucks, but it is very important. And number 7, which is the final one, which ultimately ties everything together, is shipping it, learning from it, and scaling it. So why this is key is because delivery is the proof. Systems live and die in the wild. What this ultimately means is, hey, we've delivered it. Now here's the real world scenario. It's either it lives or it dies. And once it's out there in the wild, how can we learn from it and how can we scale it? Because the number one thing is to build the solid foundation and then being able to iterate and learn from feedback as well. So how I do it, say, hey, ship fast. For example, 6K planner system is rough, real, shipped in weeks. And hey, building a feedback loop of what chaos did we kill, and then we tally that on TallySo, or we just plug it into an Airtable sheet and we say, hey, these are the feedbacks, this is the feedback that we're getting, and this is how we're actively building for that. And then the lesson that we use from this is, every build's a playbook. Next planner gets it smoother. So we actively having that mindset of, we're gonna keep learning, we're gonna keep iterating, we're never gonna stop iterating and innovating, because I like to say iteration is the key to innovation, and we're constantly just gonna be pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible today, so that in the future we can learn from it and scale it. And the grounding question I like to ask for from this is, how can this delivery make my next build sharper and lead to a new level of understanding? So ultimately saying, hey, we're building a foundation, we're going to scale it into the future. Each moving part may come into the future, but right now we need to build the core functionalities so that in the future we're able to learn from it and also just scale it into the future. And this is my take on the Chaos Killer OS build loop and what I'm actively implementing on a daily basis, and looking at this talk and saying, hey, how can we refine this? How can we constantly change things, and how can we improve this? Because that is the number one thing for me, just being a lifelong learner and just constantly pushing the boundaries and asking the questions that need to be asked in order to lead to a new level of understanding. And if you guys like this video, connect with me on X, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video. There we go.